Hi, John Chapman here. I normally say from Bletchley Park, but in this instance, it's wonderful Himley Hall. And now, of course, you can see in the background that amazing view from the hall itself, which is phenomenal. Every time I come to this place, it's really quite something special. I give the talks over the last 4 or 5 years, about 3 times I think, at the Armed Forces Day, and it's quite important to link up with armed forces about women. And so this subject is really what we call the Bletchley girls. It's the women at war at Bletchley Park. In World War II, there were about 7,500 people towards the end of the war working at Bletchley Park. There were over 12,000 that went through Bletchley Park and worked there at some time, and then went out and worked in the outstations and various other places. But for every one gentleman that worked at Bletchley Park, there were 3 ladies. So if you've got 7,500 people, you've got 5,000 plus ladies, young ladies, working at Bletchley Park breaking codes. And one of them, who I'll come on to in a short while, effectively put the Italian Navy out of World War II. One lady, 19 years of age. The women at Bletchley Park came from all over the place. They were ladies of distinction, they were ladies with the title ladies, and they came from all over. They really were phenomenal. Young women that had been to Germany and were fluent in German, young women that were fluent in French, Japanese. We had more Japanese speaking at Bletchley Park than they did in America after Pearl Harbor. Why? Because they arrested all the Japanese that were American. They didn't have anybody translating, so the Americans were in trouble with Japanese speakers. But we had more speakers, and we were teaching Japanese, which is recognised a very difficult language, and it takes something like 3 years to learn basic Japanese. They were teaching it to young women, invariably young women, at Bletchley Park in 6 months. Absolutely amazing. So these people are pretty cute. And one of them in particular was Lady Jean Ford. Come from the Isle of Arran. Her family owned the Isle of Arran, and her family were really quite something in Scotland and that area, but she as a young girl was quite ill and wasn't able to join the forces, but she badgered her mother and father to let her do something for the war effort. So they happened to know a gentleman called Mountbatten, Earl Mountbatten, who spoke to another gentleman who happened to be the Prime Minister, and she was told to report to a place in London for an interview. There she was given a ticket and told to report to Bletchley, a little place called Bletchley, which in actual fact is quite a big house called Bletchley Park, and that's where she reported. She couldn't quite get there because the train, because of an air raid, the train was stopped 3 miles outside Bletchley. So she went to the conductor and said, "Look, I've got a job to do for the war effort, and I'm going to get to Bletchley. How do I get there?" He said, "Well, you can't get off the train." She said, I'm going to walk." And she did. Even though the conductor didn't want her to walk, she walked to Bletchley Park along the railway lines because the trains weren't moving anyhow. She did have quite a few other ladies get off who found that they were going to the same place as well. And that was Lady Jean Ford. We went to interview her in 2014 in the Isle of Arran, 92 years of age, bless her, and she invited us to lunch. She said, "I don't live in the castle now because we've had to sell it for death duties. But I live in the little cottage at the entrance, which had 15 rooms when we got there. So it wasn't quite a little cottage as you think." And she told us some lovely stories, and probably the one that really sticks in the mind, and I normally over a period of 45 minutes would talk about 8 or 10 of the ladies that work there. All have great stories. This story was one of the best. They'd work hard, she said, and we'd play hard. And at 11 o'clock on a Friday, well, late Friday evening, let's say, it wasn't quite 11 p.m, she was outside hitchhiking down the main motorway, as they call it, what we call the A5, and that's what it was. And the chap in a cement truck stopped. He got out, he said, "Young lady, you really shouldn't be hitchhiking this time of night. I know you would prefer to get a lift to London in this vehicle, in a car with a young man who's in an RAF uniform, possibly even driving a Jaguar, but I'm afraid all you're going to get this time of night is me and my cement truck." And it was a great big cement truck, and that's exactly what they did. She jumped in the cement truck. I should say she climbed up to the top. He put her overnight case in the back of the cement truck, and they drove to London. And she got his whole story about his 8 children, his wife and everything else all the way there. Lovely fella, she called him George. And when they finally got there, Jules said to her, right, young lady, where can I drop you? She said, oh, drop me off at Oxford Street, Jules, that will be fine, no problem. No, I'm going to take you to your hotel. Where are you going? Ah, she says, that's a bit of a problem, it's the Savoy. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the Savoy Hotel is down a little road on its own. You can't get more than one car down. So can you imagine this cement lorry, which took the whole width of the road, driving down to the entrance of one of the poshest hotels in London? And there she was, in this cement lorry, 15 foot almost up off the ground, going into the Savoy. The guard at the front was a World War I officer, and he just stood there and said, no, 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 no. And she leaned over and said, cooey, it's mean. To which he went round, opened the front door as if it was a Rolls Royce. She slid down, went round to the boot of to the back of the cement lorry, and literally put her overnight stay as if it was the boot of a Rolls Royce. And the driver then had to do about a 12-point turn to get out of the Savoy and get back out again. That's the kind of youngsters that they were, and that's the kind of things they got up to. There was lots of other stories, but you'll have to come to the main talk when we're open again at Himley Hall for the Forces Night. They had problems recruiting people at Bletchley Park because they had to get them in and various other, and of course they had to put them into accommodation. So if you got 5,000 towards the end of the war, where are you going to accommodate them? And that particular lady ended up becoming the accommodation officer at about 19, 20 years of age, and she would go around 35 miles radius all round Bletchley, what is now Milton Keynes and all that area, Buckinghamshire, and a bit further out into Bedfordshire, and she would recruit. She'd knock on people's doors and say, you have 3 bedrooms, your husband's away at war, you have no children, I'm taking possession of 2 bedrooms, you have to put up people, and this, that and the other. She would also read the Riot Act, the fact that they couldn't do this, they couldn't do that, couldn't ask people questions, but they had to supply them with a breakfast and evening meal and that kind of thing. But of course their problem was that they would meet and they would have to find accommodation, and they used Woburn Abbey. Woburn Abbey, which is the same design as Himley Hall, except it's 8 times wider and 8 times longer, but it is the same design. In fact, it could well be a very similar architect, but unfortunately architecture on that side is not my forte. And we have a wonderful picture. We only had 5 pictures when we first came to Bletchley Park, and of those 5 pictures, one of them was the 3 ladies leaning on the gates at Woburn Abbey. And those 3 ladies, we didn't know who they were, but and Bletchley Park was opened in 1994, by 1999, all 3 of those ladies had come to light. We didn't find them, they turned up. 2 turned up, 1 had passed away, but we found all 3, and 2 of them actually got to talk to each other. Of course now they would be over 97, and unfortunately they've all passed away. So there's lots of other stories about lots of ladies at Bletchley Park, and I'll just tell you a couple more. You've probably seen on the TV, you may have even seen a certain lady making a gesture with a finger on the TV called Trumpington. Baroness Trumpington was an amazing character. In the House of Lords, her husband was Mayor of Cambridge. She was a code-breaker. She was actually made a baroness by Margaret Thatcher. And in fact, when Margaret Thatcher retired and herself went into the Lords, she went and sat on a chair on her own, and no one would sit with her. Trumpington, who'd been in the Lords for about 15 years, got up, and although she never agreed with Margaret Thatcher's political being, she walked across and sat with her on the other side of the Lords, because she had a lot of respect for the lady. Whether you like her or not, that's what Trumpington was. As far as Trumpington was concerned, the work she did at Bletchley Park, she never really told us much about, and to this day we only know a little bit about it. She did tell me once on the way to the toilet, because I was her toilet monitor. I got to know her quite well, and whenever she came to Bletchley Park, John Chapman would be called, 1, to keep me out of the way and stop me from talking people to death, and 2, to take Baroness Trumpington to the toilet. I did that 3 times over 5 visits. And on one occasion she said, of course, John, you know that us girls used to write our names on the toilet paper. And I said, really? She said, yes, the problem was, obviously we were after the boys, ripping the names out of the toilet paper and then coming looking for the girl. And I said, oh, right, I didn't know that. She said, well, my problem was my toilet paper ended up in the ladies' toilet. So I never did pull a young man. And that was a story that came out of the blue. It wasn't in her book either, which is quite funny. One of the other ladies I have to tell you about, because time is running short now, and I've got about a few minutes left, and that's the lady that effectively put the Italian Navy out of World War II. His name was Mavis Beatty. Mavis Beatty was married to Keith Beatty. Keith Beatty was one of the top code breakers at Bletchley Park, but they were not really courting in the wartime. They knew each other, but they didn't really get together until after the war. So Mavis, as a single young lady, 19 years of age, worked with Dilwyn Knox. Dilwyn Knox was what we call the Mad Welshman, an amazing cave breaker, and he was one of the early ones to break Enigma, and it was him that taught Turing the initial bits of the Enigma machine. But Mavis broke a code. It was a Japanese code. Now, the Japanese codes were in Enigma as well, but you have to understand that the Germans and the British, of course, our alphabets are very similar, although the Germans use X's, Y's and Z's much more relevant than we do. But the Japanese, they didn't have 26 letters in the alphabet. They had 95 characters and 3 different dialects. So to break a Japanese code was quite something. Well, not only did she work with a little bit on the Japanese side, but she actually broke the Italian codes as well, and they were using Enigma. Now, the Italians, of course, although they changed sides a few times during the war, and we won't go into that, the Italians were going to trap the Royal Navy in a place called Matapan. Now, Matapan's in the Mediterranean, and this came across on an Enigma message, which young Mavis Beatty broke. She took it to her boss, Dudley Knox, who then got 2 other code breakers to check that the young girl had got it right and that her maths was right. She'd got it spot on. So therefore they knew 3 days before that the Italians were going to trap the Royal Navy on as they sailed out of Matapan, or through Matapan, I should say. So Admiral Cunningham was sent the message very, very quickly, within 3 days of that actually occurring and that entrapment. That message went out to Cunningham. Cunningham was therefore able to bring in aircraft cover. He was able to bring in various other bits and pieces, like 2 other counter-attacks from squadrons, but he was also able, and that's what he decided, to sail into the entrapment. Now, the interesting thing was, he did like a certain gentleman did with the Spanish Armada. He didn't go and play bowls, he went and played golf. Now, the reason for that was, where there were spies, and of course if they saw him going to play golf, they would know that he would let his fleet sail when he wasn't particularly bothered, because they had no idea that the Italians were going to entrap them. As it was, he went on the golf course, over the top, down onto a launch, and headed up his own battle fleet. And of course he brought in air cover. Now, air cover in World War II was absolutely critical to be able to attack the opposition, and the Italians had no idea that air cover could come in within minutes of them getting into range without getting into the range of their own guns on our fleet. That battle, Churchill said, was the largest sea battle since Trafalgar. Now, we know all politicians are liable to exaggerate, and Churchill was no better or worse than any others. Although it was the largest amount of firepower, it wasn't the largest sea battle. In other words, it wasn't that many ships. There was a lot of ships, but nowhere near as much as Trafalgar, which had obviously hundreds of ships that were involved. The battle went, the British won, the Italians were put back into port and never came out again for a large sea battle. So that effectively put the Italian Navy out of World War II. One girl, just under 19 years of age. Mavis went on to marry Keith Beatty, and changed a name from a maiden name to Beatty, but she had to move out of working for the government code and cipher school, because married couples weren't allowed to work. So therefore, after the war, when they married, she became one of the most well-known people on large gardens, and that includes places like Himley Hall and landscaping the gardens after that, Luton Hoo and various other places as well. So there's an awful lot of great stories about women at Bletchley Park. If you come to the larger talk, then we'll deal with 5 or 6 others. And probably the last one to finish on was a young lady who's 94. In fact, she was 94 on the 14th of June, and that's Ruth Bourne. Ruth Bourne's still alive to this day, kicking, and she's as strong as an ox. Up until 2 years ago, she was still taking tours at 92 around Bletchley Park, and she was still working on the bomb machine, which she was a bomb operator. And when the Queen in 2011 unveiled the memorial to the codebreakers at Bletchley Park, Ruth Bourne showed her and the Duke of Edinburgh the bomb machine and demonstrated an Enigma machine.